If you travel deep into the backwoods of Tennessee, winding your way through the limestone hills and the thick canopy of white oaks, you will eventually find a place that feels suspended in time. It is a hollow where the air hangs heavy with the scent of charcoal and fermenting corn, a sweet, pungent smell that clings to your clothes and fills your lungs. This is Cave Spring Hollow. To the casual observer, it is a picturesque scene of American industry, a place of bubbling springs and rustic charm. But this hollow is also a graveyard of ambition. It is the birthplace of the most iconic whiskey brand on the planet, an empire that generates billions of dollars and stamps its black and white label on culture from Tokyo to Berlin. Yet, at the heart of this global superpower lies a story of such profound irony and tragedy that it almost feels scripted by a dark novelist. It is a story that begins not with a grand business deal or a triumphant invention, but with a moment of petty, human frustration. The year was 1906. The morning was humid, the kind of Tennessee dawn where the mist clings to the ground and the heat is already rising from the earth. Jasper Newton Daniel, known to the world simply as Jack, arrived at his office in the center of the distillery grounds. Jack was a man who demanded attention. He stood only 5 feet 2 inches tall, a diminutive figure in a land of rugged frontiersmen, but he compensated for his size with an outsized personality and a wardrobe to match. He wore a knee-length frock coat every single day, a wide-brimmed planter's hat, and a vest made of fine silk. He was a dandy in the wilderness, a man who understood that to sell whiskey, you had to sell yourself. He was the undisputed king of the hollow, a man who had built a liquor empire from a single copper still. He answered to no man, and he tolerated no incompetence. On this particular morning, however, the king was about to be dethroned by a piece of office furniture. Jack needed to access the company ledger, a book that held the secrets of his growing fortune. He walked over to the heavy iron safe that sat in the corner of the office. It was a formidable black box, built to withstand fire and theft, a symbol of the security and permanence of the Jack Daniels Company. Jack crouched down and began to spin the dial. Left, right, left. He pulled the handle. The steel bolts held fast. The door did not budge. He frowned, wiping the sweat from his brow, and tried again. He spun the numbers carefully, his mind perhaps racing with the tasks of the day, the shipments to St. Louis, the barrel counts, the mash bills. He pulled the handle again, locked tight. The humidity of the Tennessee summer was notorious for making the internal gears of complex machinery stick. The metal expanded, the oil grew tacky, and the tumblers refused to fall into place. Or perhaps, in his impatience, Jack had simply forgotten the combination. For a man like Jack Daniel, a man who had spent his life controlling every aspect of his environment, from the charcoal filtration of his whiskey to the cut of his own coat, this resistance was intolerable. The safe was an inanimate object. It had no will, no power, no right to defy him. Yet there it stood, a silent, stubborn monolith refusing to yield its contents to its master. The frustration bubbled up inside him, hot and fast. This was the flaw of the genius. The same fire that drove him to perfection also drove him to rage. He let out a shout, his face flushing red, and in a moment of pure, blind fury he lashed out. Jack Daniel drew back his left foot, clad in a sturdy leather boot, and kicked the solid iron safe with every ounce of strength in his small body. It was a kick meant to punish the metal, to force it into submission, but iron does not submit to flesh and bone. The sound that followed was not the click of a lock opening, but the sickening crunch of anatomy failing, the safe remained perfectly still, unscratched and unmoved. But inside Jack's boot, his big toe had shattered. The force of the impact pulverized the bone, sending shockwaves of pain shooting up his leg. He hopped around the dusty office, cursing the safe, cursing the humidity, cursing the morning itself. But the damage was done. In 1906, a shattered bone was not a minor inconvenience. Penicillin was decades away from being discovered. Antibiotics belonged to the realm of science fiction. In the early 20th century, the barrier between life and death was often as thin as the skin on your foot. Jack, being the stubborn patriarch that he was, refused to let the injury slow him down. He was the engine of the company. He couldn't simply take to his bed because of a sore toe. He limped through the distillery for days, the pain transforming from a sharp throb to a dull, burning heat. He soaked the foot. He wrapped it. He likely poured his own whiskey on it to dull the ache. But the environment of a distillery, wet, warm, and filled with bacteria, was the worst possible place for an open wound. The infection took root deep in the marrow of the shattered bone. Gangrene began to set in. The process was slow and horrifying. It started with discoloration, the skin turning a bruised purple, then a sickly green, and finally a dead, necrotic black. The smell of rotting flesh began to mingle with the sweet smell of the mash. The king of the hollow was decomposing while he was still alive. When the pain became unbearable, Jack finally called for the doctors. They took one look at the blackening foot and knew there was only one option. They amputated the toe, but they were too late. The poison had already traveled up into the foot. A few months later, they returned with their saws and knives, and they amputated the foot. For 6 long years, Jack Daniel fought a losing war against his own body. The infection was relentless, a slow-moving predator that consumed him inch by inch. The man who had been the life of every party, the man who loved music and dancing and conversation, was reduced to an invalid, confined to his bed in the excruciating grip of blood poisoning. His empire continued to grow outside his window. The trucks rumbled out the gates. The trains carried his name to distant cities, but Jack was trapped in a prison of pain. Finally, in 1911, the battle ended. Jasper Newton Daniel died, not from a duel, not from a rival bootlegger's bullet, and not from the alcohol he spent his life creating. He died because he lost his temper. It is the ultimate absurdity, a tragic joke that haunts the estate to this day. If you visit the distillery now, you can walk into that same office. It has been preserved exactly as it was. And there, in the corner, sits the safe. It is black, heavy, and imposing. If you look closely, you can see that it is perfectly intact. It killed the man who bought it, and it didn't even suffer a dent. It stands as a dark monument to the fragility of human life and the perils of unchecked anger. But Jack's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a dynastic crisis. The king was dead, and the throne was empty. Jack had spent his life building a legacy, but he had never taken the time to build a family. He had no wife, he had no children. There was no direct line of succession. By all the laws of business and biology, the Jack Daniels empire should have crumbled then and there, sold off for parts, or dissolved into history. But Jack had a secret weapon. He had a nephew, Lem Motlow. If Jack Daniel was the artist, Lem Motlow was the hammer. Lem was the son of Jack's sister, and he had been working at the distillery since he was a boy. But Lem was nothing like his uncle. Where Jack was charismatic and flamboyant, Lem was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient. He had the eyes of a shark and the mind of a banker. Jack had left the entire company to Lem, bypassing other relatives, because he knew that Lem was the only one with the steel required to survive the coming storm. And a storm was indeed coming. The early 1900s were not a kind time for whiskey makers. The temperance movement was sweeping across the South like a wildfire. Preachers were pounding their pulpits, condemning alcohol as the devil's juice. Politicians were drafting laws to ban the production and sale of spirits. The walls were closing in. Jack had died just as the world was turning against his creation. Lem Motlow inherited a crown that was heavy with risk. He inherited a fortune, yes, but he also inherited a target on his back. To survive, Lem knew he had to change everything. He could not run the company as a friendly, backwoods operation anymore. He had to militarize it. He had to turn the Jack Daniels name into a fortress that could withstand the assaults of the law and the competition. And the first step in that transformation was to build a headquarters that reflected his new power. He would not live in a cabin. He would not live in a modest townhouse. He would build a palace. This brings us to the second chapter of our dark history, the rise of the estate. While Jack Daniels sleeps in his grave, killed by his own rage, Lem Motlow begins to pour concrete and lay stone. He begins to construct the white mansion that still dominates the landscape today, a house that would become the center of the empire and the vault where its darkest secrets were kept. High upon the ridge that overlooks the bubbling cave spring, a new structure began to rise from the Tennessee earth. It was not a log cabin. It was not a rustic distillery building. It was a statement. This was the Motlow House, a pristine white Georgian mansion with towering columns and sweeping porches, designed to look down upon the workers and the whiskey below like a feudal castle. This house was the physical manifestation of the new regime. Jack Daniel was dead, buried in the soil with his secrets and his shattered toe. The era of the eccentric small-town distiller was over. The era of the industrial tycoon had begun. The man who built this house, Lem Motlow, was a study in contrasts to his famous uncle. While Jack was a man of the people, a charmer who relied on handshakes and personal relationships, Lem was a man of the ledger. He was stern, unyielding, and fiercely intelligent. He had inherited the company at a moment of supreme peril, and he knew that if he showed even a sliver of weakness, the wolves would come for him. The temperance movement was no longer just a nuisance. It was a political tidal wave, crashing against the walls of the distillery. States were going dry, one by one. The noose was tightening around the neck of the whiskey industry. Most distillers in Tennessee were folding, selling off their copper stills for scrap and retreating into obscurity. But Lem Motlow did not retreat. He dug in. The Motlow House became his command center. From the parlor of this mansion, Lem waged a war for the survival of the brand. He didn't just make whiskey, he made laws, recognizing that the only way to save the family business was to control the political machine. Lem ran for the Tennessee state legislature. He became a senator, not out of a desire for public service, but out of a desperate need to protect his barrels. He fought tooth and nail in the halls of the Capitol, arguing that Tennessee whiskey was not a vice, but a vital economic engine. He was a whiskey baron sitting in a dry legislature, a fox guarding the henhouse, using his wealth and influence to carve out loopholes that would keep the stills running while his competitors were shut down. But the true genius of Lem Motlow and the darkness that haunts the estate was not just in how he fought the law, but in how he fought for the brand's image. Lem understood something that Jack had only instinctively grasped. Americans don't buy a product, they buy a story. As the country hurled toward the modernization of the 20th century, people were becoming nostalgic for the good old days. They wanted to believe in a simpler time, a time of front porches, slow-talking Southern gentlemen, and handmade craftsmanship. Lem realized that the greatest asset he had wasn't the liquid in the barrel, but the ghost of his uncle. He began to mythologize Jack Daniel. Under Lem's direction, the company leaned heavily into the imagery of the Old South. They emphasized the old number, 7. They crafted a narrative of a lone white frontiersman taming the wilderness with nothing but a copper, still, and a dream. The Motlow House, with its grand architecture and aristocratic air, served as the perfect backdrop for this new mythology. It projected stability, tradition, and racial hierarchy. It was a symbol of the Southern aristocracy that the Northern markets found so fascinatingly romantic. But to make this story perfect, to make it palatable to a segregated America that was deeply divided by race, Lem Motlow had to perform a surgical excision of history. The distillery operation had changed. It was no longer a small team of men working by the spring. It was a factory. But the marketing depicted a frozen moment in time. And in this frozen moment, there was no room for the complex reality of how the whiskey came to be. There was no room for the uncomfortable truth that the Lincoln County process, the very soul of the whiskey, was not a white invention. As the walls of the Motlow House went up, the truth about the origins of the recipe was buried beneath them. The estate became a vault. Inside the mansion, the family enjoyed the immense wealth generated by the global expansion. They walked on polished floors, paid for by the old number 7, surrounded by portraits of Confederate ancestors and symbols of the antebellum South. It was during this era that the company truly went global. Lem Motlow was relentless. Even when national prohibition finally struck in 1920, shutting down the legal production of alcohol across the United States, Lem didn't just give up. He played the long game. He stockpiled cash. He maintained the estate. He kept the Motlow House shining on the hill, a beacon of defiance waiting for the laws to change. When repeal finally came in 1933, while other distilleries were ruined ruins, Jack Daniel's roared back to life instantly. Lem was ready. He flooded the market, sending his square bottles to every bar and shelf in the country. The brand exploded. It became the drink of Frank Sinatra, of Hollywood stars, of soldiers fighting in World War II. But as the money poured in, transforming the Motlow clan into one of the wealthiest families in the South, the disconnect between the image and the reality grew wider. The public saw Uncle Jack, the friendly neighbor. The reality was a corporate empire run from a white mansion that rivaled the great estates of the Gilded Age. The public saw a rustic backwoods tradition. The reality was a highly calculated marketing machine that had erased the contributions of the African Americans who had built the foundation of the company. The Motlow House stands today as a testament to this era of dominance. It is beautiful, yes, the architecture is stunning, but it is a beauty that feels cold. When you walk the grounds of the estate, you can feel the weight of Lem Motlow's ambition. You can imagine him standing on the balcony, looking down at the hollow, calculating the profit margins, drafting the political speeches, and carefully curating the lies that would become legends. He saved the company. There is no doubt about that. Without Lem Motlow, the name Jack Daniel would be nothing more than a footnote in a dusty history book. But in saving the company, he sold its soul. He traded the messy, inclusive truth of the hollow for the pristine, whitewashed image of the mansion. And yet, for all his power, for all his political maneuvering and wealth, Lem Motlow could not escape the final irony of the region he ruled. He could build a mansion. He could buy senators. He could conquer the global alcohol market, but he could not change the heart of his own neighbors. As the distillery grew into a behemoth, the town of Lynchburg remained stubbornly pious. The temperance movement had taken deep roots in the soil of Moore County, roots that even the Motlow millions couldn't dig up. The county voted to remain dry even after the federal ban was lifted. This created a surreal existence for the family and the estate. They were the kings of whiskey living in a dry kingdom. They were shipping millions of gallons of liquor out of the hollow every year, filling the glasses of the world. But if they wanted to host a dinner party at the Motlow House, they technically had to break the law to serve their own product. It was a friction that existed then and exists now, a tension between the sin industry and the Bible Belt culture that surrounds it. The Motlow House was an island of indulgence in a sea of prohibition. As we leave the era of Lem Motlow, we are left with a picture of a dynasty at its peak. The mansion is built. The safe is a relic in the office. The brand is a global icon. The Jack Daniel myth is solidified in the American consciousness, but deep in the archives, buried under decades of marketing brochures and corporate biographies, a ghost was waiting to be found. The story that Lem Motlow had so carefully scrubbed from the record was about to resurface. The walls of the estate could keep the world out, but they couldn't keep the truth silent forever. The true scandal of the Jack Daniels empire wasn't about the alcohol. It was about the man who taught Jack how to make it. And his name wasn't Dan Call. For more than 100 years, the Jack Daniels brand was built on a very specific creation myth. If you took a tour of the distillery in the 1950s, 80s, or even the early 2000s, the guides would tell you a heartwarming story about the origins of the whiskey. They would tell you that a young Jack Daniel, a runaway boy with a dream, was taken in by a Lutheran preacher and grocer named Dan Call. The story went that Reverend Call was a man of God who also dabbled in moonshine, and he took young Jack under his wing, teaching him the secrets of the still. It was a perfect piece of Southern folklore, the pious white mentor passing down his wisdom to the ambitious white apprentice. It was safe, it was wholesome, and, as we now know, it was a fabrication. The truth of what happened in that hollow is far more complex and far more significant to American history. The secret ingredient in the Jack Daniels success story wasn't a preacher. It was a slave. His name was Nearest Green. For generations, his name was whispered in the hollows of Lynchburg, but absent from the corporate brochures. Nearest Green was an enslaved man, owned by the preacher Dan Call. He was the one who actually ran the still on the Call farm. He was the one who possessed the skill, the patience, and the technical knowledge required to turn corn mash into high-quality spirit. And most importantly, Nearest Green was the master of the Lincoln County process, the technique of filtering the raw whiskey through 10 feet of sugar maple charcoal to remove impurities. This process, which gives Jack Daniels its signature smooth taste and legally distinguishes it as Tennessee whiskey rather than bourbon, has roots that can be traced back to West African purification traditions. It wasn't a white invention. It was an adaptation brought across the ocean in the memory of stolen people. When young Jack Daniel arrived at the Call farm, it wasn't the preacher who taught him. Reverend Call was a busy man with a congregation to lead. He pointed Jack toward the still house and said, "Uncle Nearest is the best whiskey maker that I know of." It was Nearest Green who took the boy in. It was Nearest Green who taught him how to select the wood, how to burn the charcoal, and how to judge the flow of the spirit. The relationship between the future king of whiskey and the enslaved man was not one of master and servant, but of mentor and protege. This is where the story takes a surprising turn. In most dark histories of American business, the founder is the villain who exploits the labor of others. But by all accounts, Jack Daniel himself was not the villain of this specific chapter. When slavery ended after the Civil War and Jack started his own independent distillery, he didn't cast Nearest aside. He hired him. Nearest Green became the very first master distiller of the Jack Daniel Distillery, the first African-American master distiller on record in the United States. He was a free man earning a wage, working side by side with Jack. In the early days, the Green family and the Daniel family were intertwined. Jack was often photographed with Nearest's sons. There was a genuine respect there, a recognition of talent that transcended the brutal racial caste system of the 19th century. So, how did this history disappear? How did the man who invented the recipe become a ghost? The erasure didn't happen during Jack's life. It happened after. It happened when the walls of the Motlow House went up. When Lem Motlow took control and began to turn the distillery into a global empire, the narrative shifted. We must remember the context. The early 20th century was the height of the Jim Crow era. The South was segregated by law and by violence. Marketing a luxury product to white customers in the 1920s or 30s with a black man as the hero of the story was seen as bad business. It was a complication that the corporate machine didn't want to deal with. And so, the editing began. Slowly, quietly, Nearest Green was faded out of the picture. The official company biographies began to focus exclusively on Dan Call and Jack. The charcoal filtering process was presented as a mysterious local innovation or a stroke of Jack's genius. The Green family, who continued to work at the distillery for generations, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Nearest still working the stills, saw their ancestors' legacy stripped away. They knew the truth. The locals in Lynchburg knew the truth, but the world was sold the lie. For decades, the Dan Call story was printed on millions of pamphlets, repeated on thousands of tours, and cemented in the public imagination. The lie was so successful that even serious historians accepted it as fact. The Motlow dynasty had built a wall of silence around the origins of their fortune. They had taken the intellectual property of a former slave, built a billion-dollar empire upon it, and then denied him the credit. It was the ultimate act of appropriation. The Motlow House stood as a shiny white monument to this revised history. It represented the Gone with the Wind version of the South, stately, genteel, and exclusively white. Meanwhile, the truth lay buried in the census records and the oral histories of the African-American community in Moore County. It wasn't until 2016, over a century after Jack kicked the safe, that the company finally, officially admitted the truth. As the brand prepared for its 150th anniversary, they decided it was time to stop hiding. They updated their history. They acknowledged that it was Nearest Green, not Dan Call, who was the true teacher. The revelation sent shockwaves through the whiskey world. It rewrote the history of American spirits. But for the descendants of nearest green, and for those who know the dark history of the estate, the admission was bittersweet. It was a validation, yes, but it was also a reminder of the century of silence. It was a reminder that the old number 7 label, recognized in every bar on earth, had been carrying a secret debt that could never truly be repaid. This scandal fundamentally changes how we look at the estate. When you see the distillery today, you aren't just looking at Jack Daniel's legacy. You are looking at Nearest Green's masterpiece, the very water that flows from the cave spring, the very method used to mellow every single drop. It is all a testament to a man who was owned by another, yet created something that conquered the world. The Motlow House may have held the power, but the still house held the genius. And for 100 years, the mansion tried to pretend the genius didn't exist. As the dust settles on this revelation, we are left with the final and perhaps most bizarre layer of the Jack Daniel's story. We have the founder killed by his anger. We have the heir who built a fortress of secrets. We have the stolen legacy of the slave. But there is one more twist, a twist that affects every single person who makes the pilgrimage to the estate today. The final irony is not about who makes the whiskey, but about who is allowed to drink it. As the sun sets over the Motlow House, casting long shadows across the valley of the Hollow, we arrive at the final and perhaps most maddening contradiction of the Jack Daniel's empire. It is a twist that feels almost too strange to be true, a final cosmic joke played on the legacy of the whiskey barons who ruled this hill. If you were to visit the estate today, you would walk past the heavy iron gates, past the cave spring where Nearest Green perfected his craft, and past the office where Jack Daniel kicked his safe. You would see the massive barrel houses, the rick houses, sitting on the high ridges, holding millions of gallons of aging whiskey. The air in this valley is so thick with the angel's share, the evaporated alcohol rising from the wood, that the trees themselves are stained black by a fungus that feeds on the ethanol vapor. You are standing in the absolute center of the whiskey universe, a place that pumps out 150 million bottles a year. But if you walk out the front gate of the distillery, cross the small town square of Lynchburg, and walk into a restaurant to order a glass of Jack Daniel's on the rocks, the waiter will look at you and shake his head. You cannot buy a drink here. You cannot order a shot. You cannot sit at a bar. Moore County, Tennessee, the home of the biggest whiskey brand on earth, is a dry county. It has been dry since 1910, 10 years before national prohibition even began. While the rest of the country eventually legalized alcohol again in 1933, the people of Moore County voted to keep the ban. For over a century, in the town that makes the poison, it has been illegal to swallow it. This irony defined the existence of the Motlow dynasty. Lem Motlow, the man who built the White Mansion and conquered the global market, spent his entire political life fighting this battle. He was a paradox in human form, a whiskey baron living in a town of temperance. Lem ran for the Tennessee State Senate, not out of civic duty, but out of survival instinct. He fought vicious legal battles in the state capitol, maneuvering through a maze of religious opposition and dry laws just to keep the distillery open. He successfully argued that making whiskey was a manufacturing business, no different than making chairs or shoes, and therefore should be legal even if drinking it was a sin. He won the right to make it, but he never won the right to sell it by the glass. This created a surreal existence for the family in the Motlow House. They were the wealthiest family in the region, shipping liquid gold to London, Paris, and New York. They hosted senators and celebrities at the estate. Yet, strictly speaking, serving their own product at a dinner party in Lynchburg was a crime. They were kings of a kingdom they were forbidden to taste. To this day, the brand has to rely on a bizarre legal loophole to sell anything to the millions of tourists who make the pilgrimage to the estate. If you go to the White Rabbit bottle shop on the distillery grounds, they will sell you a bottle. But legally, they are not selling you whiskey. They are selling you a commemorative souvenir decanter which just happens to be filled with whiskey. It is a legal gymnastics act that allows the empire to function within the rigid moral code of the Bible Belt. It captures the tension that has always existed here, the friction between the sin industry that pays the bills and the pious culture that surrounds it. In the end, the Jack Daniels estate is a monument to a founder killed by his own temper and a dynasty built on a stolen recipe. It is the ultimate irony. A global empire of alcohol ruled from a mansion where buying a drink is still a crime. The label might be black and white, but the truth is always gray.